Racist cop detained black woman for 43 minutes. She was auditing him. Renee Wallace set her laptop in the tray, her shoes, her belt, her blazer, every single thing the signs required. The scanner passed over her carry-on in silence. Craig Hollis pointed at her anyway. "Step aside, please." Renee picked up her shoulder bag and stepped aside. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She had stood in this exact geometry before, in other airports with other badge numbers, and she had learned that asking why was never the part that mattered. What Craig didn't know was that Renee hadn't come to Atlanta for her flight. She had come specifically for Checkpoint 7. For him. For the 47 complaints filed over 3 years that had gone nowhere, done nothing, changed nothing. In the secondary screening room, Craig took her phone, searched her bag twice, asked her to sign a form that existed in no TSA manual anywhere. 43 minutes. In the supervisor's inbox, sitting unread in 7:52 that morning, was a federal notification email. Subject line, Audit Visit, Civil Prites, Checkpoint 7, do not interfere with auditor. Craig never saw it. He raised his finger and pointed at Renee Wallace instead. Some silences don't stay quiet. Hit subscribe and drop a comment if something about this moment won't let you go. And now the story begins. The TSA agent pointed at Renee Wallace before her shoes even reached the conveyor belt. Not at the man directly behind her, whose overstuffed duffel had already triggered the scanner alarm twice. Not at the teenager, 3 spots ahead, who had sent a forgotten water bottle through the X-ray in her backpack and held up the entire line for 4 minutes. At Renee, who had removed her laptop in its own tray, her liquids in their clear zip bag, her shoes, her belt, her dark navy blazer, and who had done every single thing the posted signs required. Craig Hollis, badge 7743, 18 years, with the Transportation Security Administration, 12 formal complaints in a personnel file nobody at Checkpoint 7 had ever finished reading, raised one finger and crooked it in her direction. "Step aside, please." The word please was a habit by now, stripped of everything it had once contained. Renee lifted her shoulder bag from the tray and stepped aside. She did not ask why. She had stood inside this particular geometry before, in other airports with other badge numbers and other names, and she had learned that asking why was not the useful part. What mattered was the time. She glanced at the clock mounted high on the far wall, 9:43 a.m. She pressed the image into her memory without reaching for a pen. Behind her, a woman in a red cardigan went back to studying her boarding pass. A man in a blue suit watched his phone. The airport exhaled and moved around her like water breaking around a post, and Renee stood at the edge of Checkpoint 7 and waited. She had arrived at this checkpoint at 9:38 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than the window specified in the audit coordination email. She had done this deliberately. She wanted to be in line long enough to be ordinary, to be simply one more person removing shoes and laptops, not a federal investigator but a woman in a navy blazer with a carry-on and a worn shoulder bag and a flight to catch. Craig Hollis snapped a pair of blue nitrile gloves over his hands, fresh pair, practiced motion, and turned toward her tray. He was a large man, not heavy but wide through the shoulders and chest, with the particular kind of stillness that forms in people who have occupied a space of authority long enough to confuse it with themselves. He opened her carry-on first, dark green soft-sided 3 separate zippers. He worked through the interior with methodical patience, pressing both hands through folded clothes, unzipping the interior pocket, charging cable, a sealed packet of aspirin, travel toothpaste in a clear bag. He zipped it closed. He lifted her shoulder bag next. Worn brown leather, the handles whitened at the seams, the body of it soft and darkened from years of daily use. He unsnapped the top clasp and looked inside. Phone in a plain matte black case. Metal water bottle with a sticker half peeled off one side. A small zipper pouch. He pressed it, felt the rigid edge of a power bank. A pack of spearmint gum. And a yellow legal pad spiral bound with a silver pen clipped to the top wire. He lifted the legal pad. He tilted it toward the overhead fluorescence and held it there long enough to read. Small, even handwriting across the top third of the first page. A column of times in the left margin, written in blue ink. He studied it for a moment that went on slightly longer than it needed to. He set it down. He reached for the phone instead. Renee said quietly, "I'd rather you didn't handle the phone. Ma'am, this is a standard secondary screening. I understand that." He placed the phone face down on the plastic shelf beside the tray. He unscrewed the cap from the water bottle, tilted it to the light, replaced the cap. He repacked the shoulder bag. The legal pad went in at an angle, the spine pressing the pen sideways against the leather. She watched him do it. She didn't reach out to straighten it. Craig stripped the gloves from both hands with a double snap and looked at her. 18 years of that look, flat, authoritative, final. She met it without hurry. "I'm going to need you to come with me for a moment," he said. Renee picked up the shoulder bag by its worn handles. "Of course," she said. The secondary screening room was small and fluorescent. 2 blue plastic chairs against one wall, a fold-out table along another, a wall clock with a second hand that advanced in small mechanical jerks. Renee sat down without being told to sit. She placed her shoulder bag across her lap and let her carry-on stand upright beside her left foot. She looked at the clock, 9:47. She said it softly, under her breath, barely sound at all, the way you'd whisper a word you needed to keep. Through the narrow window set into the door, she could see a strip of the checkpoint floor. The belt rolling, the scanner arch, the steady file of passengers. A female TSA officer crossed from left to right, walking briskly with a clipboard tucked under one arm. She didn't look through the window, but as she passed, her pace stuttered. A single half-step of hesitation that lasted less than a second, and then she was gone. Renee looked back at the fold-out table. Craig came in 2 minutes later with a younger officer she hadn't seen before. Light-haired, late 20s, a trainee badge dangling from his lanyard. The trainee took a position near the door and did not speak again for a long time. Craig stood across the table from Renee. "Where are you flying today?" "Washington, D.C. Purpose of travel?" "Work." He wrote on a departmental notepad. Short strokes. The clock moved to 9:51. Through the narrow window, she could see the belt still rolling, and the passengers still filing through, and the morning at Hartsfield-Jackson still unfolding without her in it. Indifferent and continuous and entirely unconcerned with what was happening in this room. He asked for her full name, date of birth, home address. She gave each one cleanly. Then your employer, federal government. He looked up. She looked back at him. He wrote it down. Then he said, "I'm going to need the phone," she said. "Under 49 CFR 154107, your screening authority covers items that present a specific transportation security threat. My phone went through the X-ray machine with no alarm. Could you tell me what threat concern you're working from?" The trainee near the door shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Craig's pen paused on the notepad, barely half a second. Then he said, "This is a secondary screening procedure, ma'am. I need your cooperation." "I'm cooperating. I've answered every question. I've been in this room for 9 minutes." She said it without sharpness. He looked at the notepad. He looked at her. "The phone," he said. She picked it up. She held it for a moment in both hands. Black screen, no case graphics, no scratches. Then she set it face down on the table in front of him. She folded her hands on top of her shoulder bag. Beneath her thumbs, the worn leather was warm. Craig picked up the phone. He turned it over. Screen locked. Plain black background. He set it back down. "Is there anything in your bag that you haven't already shown me?" he said. She met his gaze steadily. "No," she said. Craig unsnapped her shoulder bag again and pulled out the yellow legal pad. He turned past the first page to the second. Blank. Third page, blank. He fanned through to the end. Blank from page 2 onward. He set it down on the table and did not look at the first page again. He reached past the legal pad and lifted the zipper pouch. He pressed the sides of it, feeling for anything rigid beyond the power bank. He set it down. He picked up the spearmint gum and turned it over. He set it down. He lifted the metal water bottle a second time, the same water bottle he had unscrewed and inspected at checkpoint 7, and tilted it in both directions. The water inside moved audibly. He replaced the cap. He set the water bottle down beside the phone. He stood back and looked at everything arranged on the fold-out table. Phone, water bottle, zipper pouch, gum, legal pad, the small rectangle of leather she had not yet named. Craig called for a female officer to conduct the pat-down. Her name was Alicia Torres, according to her badge, and she came in with the unhurried precision of someone who had performed this procedure thousands of times and made peace with what it was. She spoke to Renee directly, explaining each step before she took it, which was protocol and which Craig had not done when he opened the shoulder bag. Alicia Torres was thorough and calm, and when she finished, she stepped back and said quietly to Craig, "Clear." Craig nodded. He was writing on the departmental notepad again, pressing the pen into the paper with more force than necessary. Renee watched the point of the pen move. The secondary room had a faint smell of recycled air and coffee from somewhere far off, and the clock on the wall said 9:58. 15 minutes she had been in this room. Alicia Torres left, and the door swung almost shut behind her. "I need to make a call," Renee said. Craig did not look up. "You're not being detained." She looked at him. He was still writing. "If I'm not detained, I can leave." His pen stopped. He put it down with a careful, deliberate motion and looked across the table at her. "You're free to go at any time," he said. "But if you leave before we complete the process, we'll need to involve airport law enforcement." "On what basis?" he said. "Failure to cooperate with TSA screening protocol." "I cooperated with secondary screening." A female officer completed a full pat-down. My carry-on and shoulder bag were searched. My phone was examined. I answered every question. "What specific step do you believe remains incomplete?" he said. "The process isn't complete." "What step remains?" He picked up his pen. He didn't write anything. Outside the narrow window, a child was crying somewhere in the checkpoint. The sound was thin and far away, then it stopped. A mother's voice, low and soothing, and then the ordinary noise of the airport reasserted itself. Wheels on tile, distant announcements, the percussive thud of bags dropped into bins. The room Renee was sitting in had no windows to the outside world. It had only the narrow window in the door, and through it the checkpoint, and through the checkpoint the terminal, and somewhere beyond the terminal the morning. She had been inside for 23 minutes. She said, "I'd like to speak with your supervisor." Craig said, "That can be arranged." He said it in a tone that made clear it would not be arranged quickly. He stood, and for a moment he filled the small room, broad shoulders, overhead light directly behind him. He opened the door and spoke to someone in a voice too low to carry. The door swung partly closed again. Renee reached into her shoulder bag. She moved past the water bottle, past the zipper pouch, and closed her fingers around a small, worn rectangle of leather near the bottom. She had placed it there at 6 a.m. that morning in the parking structure at the other end of the terminal. She had not reached for it once in the past 17 minutes. She held it in her hand now, the leather warm, the edge of it pressing against the heel of her thumb. She did not open it. She set it in her lap, beneath the weight of both hands, and she waited for the door to open again. Marcus Tate came in first. He was 51, with the build of someone who had been large, and then gone thin and kept some of both, and he wore the shift supervisor's lanyard like he'd forgotten it was there. He had a cup of coffee in one hand and the look of a man pulled from a different problem to handle this one. Craig stood at the door behind him and did not come fully into the room. Marcus sat in the second blue chair across the table from Renee. He set the coffee down. "Miss Wallace, I understand there's been some delay." 31 minutes, she said. He looked at Craig. Craig was writing on the notepad again. Marcus looked back at Renee. "I want to assure you that." The door opened a few inches and Daniel Park put his face in. He was 29 years old, with a name tag that was slightly crooked and a uniform that was carefully pressed. In his right hand he held a paper cup of water. He said to no one specifically, "Excuse me, I thought." He looked at Renee. He stepped the rest of the way in and held out the paper cup. "I'm sorry about the wait," he said. He did not look at Craig. The trainee near the door watched the ceiling. Renee took the water and said, "Thank you." She meant it. Daniel Park nodded and left without ceremony. Craig watched the door close. Marcus cleared his throat. "Miss Wallace, I want to apologize for any inconvenience. I believe we can get you on your way." My flight board's in 22 minutes, Marcus said. Right. He looked at Craig again. Craig said, we haven't run the full check. Marcus said, we ran everything through the system. I mean the additional check. The secondary. Marcus turned from Craig very slowly, the way a man turns when he is deciding what to do with his face before anyone sees it. There's no procedure called secondary, he said. There's a form, Craig said. I need her to sign the form. Renee said, what form? Craig reached into his jacket and produced a half sheet of laminated paper. He set it on the table. It was not a standard TSA form. The header was typed in small caps and the body was a statement acknowledging voluntary cooperation with enhanced screening. She read it in 4 seconds. She said, this isn't a TSA regulatory form. Craig said, it's a checkpoint level document. That's not what I said. She slid it back across the table. Craig's jaw tightened. The clock said 10:14, 31 minutes. The trainee near the door had his eyes on a point somewhere between the floor and the wall. Marcus picked up the half sheet, read it, set it face down on the table, and did not pick up his coffee again. Through the narrow window, the belt kept moving, and the passengers kept filing through, and the airport kept going without any of them. Marcus said, Craig. A word. He stood. Craig stayed at the door. The space between them was about 4 feet. Outside, Marcus said. Craig looked at Renee. She looked back at him. He pushed off the doorframe and followed Marcus into the hallway. The door did not fully close. Renee did not move to listen. She finished the water Daniel had brought her, set the paper cup on the table, and looked at the clock. 10:16. In the hallway, she could hear Marcus speaking. Not the words, just the cadence of a man being firm about something. Craig's voice came back once, short and flat, 2 syllables defensive. Then Marcus again. Then silence. Renee's phone was still face down on the table. She didn't reach for it. She watched the door. It opened. Marcus came back in first. His face had resolved into something careful and closed. Craig stood at the door without coming in. Marcus said, Ms. Wallace, I want to personally apologize. You're free to collect your belongings. What about the form? Craig said from the doorway. Marcus turned to face him with the particular patience of a man being tested. The form isn't applicable here. She hasn't signed it. It's not applicable, Craig. Pack it up. Craig's expression did not change. He came into the room. He picked the half sheet off the table where it lay face down. He folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket. He picked up the departmental notepad. He uncapped his pen and looked at Renee. I'll still need your travel documentation for the record. You already ran my ID. She had handed him her driver's license when she first came into the room. She had watched him run it through the system. I need it again for the addendum. Marcus said, Craig. One word. Level. Craig's pen was raised, the point of it aimed at the notepad. His hand was completely still. No one in the room breathed at the same rate. Renee reached into her shoulder bag. Her hand bypassed the phone, bypassed the legal pad, and closed around the small worn rectangle of leather at the bottom. She placed it on the table. She did not open it. Craig looked at it. It looked like a simple wallet. It looked like nothing. His pen was still raised. He said, Is that your ID? Open it, she said. She said it quietly. Her voice had not changed at all in 37 minutes. Outside, in the corridor beyond the door, someone was pushing a luggage cart, and the wheels made a rhythmic sound against the floor tile, a sound that was perfectly ordinary and entirely indifferent to what was happening in the secondary screening room at 10:18 on a Tuesday morning at the busiest airport in the world. The wheels passed and the sound faded, and the room was quiet again. Craig was still looking at the leather case. He was looking at it the way you look at something you cannot quite categorize, something that does not fit neatly into the system you have been operating inside for 18 years. Craig reached for it. Marcus said, Wait. One syllable and Craig's hand stopped. Marcus looked at the leather case on the table. He looked at Renee. Something moved in his expression. Not recognition, not yet, but the leading edge of it, the way clouds change before rain without announcing it. He said to Craig, Step out, please. Craig said, I'm the agent of record on this screening. Step out. Craig looked at Renee one more time. The same flat look, unchanged, 18 years old. And he walked out of the room without closing the door behind him. The trainee followed without being asked. Marcus sat back down in the blue chair. He did not touch the leather case. The room was very quiet. Through the narrow window, the checkpoint continued its operation. Trays moving, shoes going through, briefcases opened and closed. A small child was lifted through the scanner arch by her mother. The airport, proceeding without interruption. Marcus said, "Mrs. Wallace, may I ask, what specifically brings you to Atlanta today?" She said, "I'd like to answer that with the case open, if you don't mind." He nodded. She opened the leather case. Inside, behind a clear plastic panel, was a federal credential. Gold seal on the right. Her photograph on the left. Her name in serif type beneath. United States Department of Justice. Civil Rights Division. Renee A. Wallace, Senior Investigator. She placed it face up on the table between them. Marcus looked at it for a long time. He looked at it the way you look at something you don't want to have been true. He said, "How long have you been here?" "Since 9:38 a.m., were you?" He stopped. Started again. "Were you here specifically too?" He stopped again. He picked up the credential and looked at the back, and put it down, and looked at the front. The clock on the wall said 10:22. Renee had been in the secondary screening room for 35 minutes. She had been in this room because Craig Hollis had put her here. She did not say this. She waited. Marcus reached for his phone and typed something. He stared at the screen. His face did what faces do when the information arriving on them is not hypothetical. He put the phone down. "There was an email," he said. "Yes," she said. "From the Regional Audit Coordinator." "Yes. It was in my inbox at 7:52 this morning." He said it like a man reading his own sentence aloud. She said nothing. He stood. He straightened his lanyard. He looked at the credential on the table, then at Renee, then at the door. He said, "I'm going to need a minute." He walked to the door and opened it. The checkpoint sound came in, a wave of it, full and indifferent and ongoing. Renee sat alone at the fold-out table and listened. She picked up the credential case and held it in both hands. The leather was so worn it felt like cloth. She had carried it for 9 years. It had been through airports in 6 states, through courtrooms, through offices that smelled like carpet cleaner and old ambition. It had never needed to be opened in this particular way before. She thought about the 47 complaints that had come before her. She thought about the names on those forms, the dates, the terminal numbers, the identical geometry of each one, the finger, the step aside, the room. She thought about the ones who had not known the law by chapter and verse, who had not had 9 years of practice at being even. She thought about a woman named LaToya Bridgman from Nashville, who had filed her complaint 11 months ago, and who had written in the margin of the form, in pencil, "Will anyone actually read this?" Someone had read it. Renee had read every one of them. She set the credential on the table. She straightened the legal pad in her shoulder bag. She pressed her thumb against the face of her watch. 10:23. The door opened again, and it was not Craig. Marcus came back with a woman Renee hadn't seen before. Compact, 50s, administrative lanyard, the look of someone found in the middle of something else. Behind them both, barely visible through the door, stood Craig at the checkpoint floor, arms at his sides, the departmental notepad still in his hand. The woman said she was the airport's federal liaison. Her name was Patricia Voss. She sat down. Marcus remained standing. Patricia Voss looked at the credential on the table, then at Renee, and said, "I've just been briefed by the regional coordinator." She set a printed email on the table next to the credential, forwarded twice, 3 addresses deep, and at the bottom the original send 7:52 a.m. Subject line, "Audit Visit Notification. Checkpoint 7/09/30/11 today. Do not interfere with auditor." Renee read it. She had written the original version herself. Patricia Voss said, "This email was in the checkpoint supervisor's queue this morning." Marcus said, "Yes." He said it to the floor, and Agent Hollis was not made aware. No, Patricia Voss looked at the clock. 10:26. So Agent Hollis initiated secondary screening at 9:43, Renee said. Conducted a search of my carry-on and shoulder bag. requested my phone, asked me to sign a non-standard checkpoint document, attempted to retain my phone after the pat-down was complete, and has been in this room or at this door for 43 minutes. Patricia Voss wrote on a small pad. She wrote quickly. Marcus's lanyard swung once when he shifted his weight and then hung still. Patricia Voss said, "Mrs. Wallace, I want to be absolutely clear. This airport's administration had no intention." "I know," Renee said. "The email was there. It wasn't opened. What I need now is for the checkpoint footage from 9:38 forward to be preserved." Patricia Voss said, "Yes." She was already reaching for her phone. Marcus said, "Craig's been with the department for 18 years. He said it to no one in particular, quietly, the way you'd say something you didn't mean as a defense but weren't sure what else to do with." Renee picked up the yellow legal pad from her bag and uncapped the silver pen. She turned to the second page. She began to write. She wrote the time, the full name on the badge number, the number of minutes, the name of the trainee, the name of the female officer who had passed the window at 9:47, the name on the badge of the officer who had brought her water. She had noted it without appearing to. She wrote for 4 minutes without looking up. When she finished, she capped the pen and set the pad on the table, beside the credential and the email. She looked at Patricia Voss and said, "I'll need a formal interview with your compliance officer before I leave the building." They found Craig at the checkpoint desk, not at the screening belt where he was supposed to be, but at the supervisor's station, standing beside the desk with one hand on the back of a chair, like a man waiting for something he couldn't name. Patricia Voss and Marcus walked out together. Renee stayed in the secondary room. She could see through the narrow window. She watched Marcus go to Craig. She watched Craig's expression change and then arrange itself and then change again and then go flat. She watched him look at Marcus without speaking. She watched Marcus say something she couldn't hear. Craig said something back. Marcus shook his head. Craig said something again, louder this time, and 3 passengers in the secondary lane glanced up. Marcus put one hand briefly on Craig's upper arm, not roughly, just the way you'd indicate that something was over, and Craig shook it off. The departmental notepad was still in Craig's hand. He set it on the desk. He picked it up again. Patricia Voss came back inside the secondary room and said to Renee, "Airport compliance has been reached. Checkpoint footage from 9:35 onward has been flagged and preserved. Thank you. There's also a..." She paused. "One of the officers has asked to speak with the compliance team." Renee said, "Which one?" Patricia Voss checked her pad. "Park. Daniel Park." Renee thought of the paper cup of water and the careful way he had said, "I'm sorry about the wait," without looking at Craig. She said, "That's good." She meant that too. The compliance officer arrived 20 minutes later, a woman named Sandra Reeves, DOJ contracted, who had driven from her office 12 minutes away and brought a portable recorder and 2 pens. Sandra Reeves sat up at the fold-out table and asked Renee to walk through the sequence from arrival at the checkpoint. Renee walked her through it from 9:38 a.m. to 10:26 a.m. She did it without consulting the legal pad. She had it in the order it happened. The finger, the conveyor, the room, the gloves, the pad, the phone, the form, the water, Marcus, Craig's face when Patricia Voss had arrived, the notepad still in Craig's hand. Sandra Reeves typed while Renee spoke. At one point, Sandra paused and said, "When you placed the credential on the table, why then and not earlier?" Renee said, "Because I needed the record to show what he would do without knowing who I was." Sandra Reeves typed. She said, "And the 47 prior complaints." "They're the reason I'm here," Renee said. "They're the reason this airport was flagged. They're the reason the audit was ordered." She said it without drama. Sandra Reeves looked at the credential case, still on the table. She said, 47 complaints, and this is the first federal investigation." Renee said, "Yes." That word landed in the room with enough weight that neither of them added anything to it for a moment. Craig Hollis was placed on administrative suspension at 11:04 a.m. His checkpoint access was revoked by physical card deactivation. Marcus carried the reader to him personally, and his departmental notepad was surrendered as documentation. He left through the employee exit on the north side of the terminal, past the numbered doors, past the staff vending machines, past the framed poster that read Akasikius is a shard responsibility. He did not look at any of it. He had his car keys in his left hand and held them tightly enough that the teeth pressed into his palm. And when he pushed through the door into the Atlanta morning, he did not look back at Checkpoint 7. He had 18 years of looking at it. He was done. Sandra Reeves completed the preliminary record at 11:31 a.m. The formal investigation, initiated that same afternoon under the DOJ Civil Rights Division's Airport Compliance Unit, would take 4 months. It would involve the review of 3,847 checkpoint interactions across an 18-month period, of which 211 were flagged for extended secondary screening. Of the 211, 178 involved passengers whose race was recorded on initial screening documentation. Of those 178, Craig Hollis had personally initiated 94. His personnel file, which nobody at Checkpoint 7 had finished reading in full, contained 12 formal complaints across 11 years. It also contained a note from a regional supervisor dated 3 years prior. Recommend enhanced oversight. Not implemented. The federal investigation subpoenaed that note. Renee's legal pad, yellow, spiral-bound 47 pages, the first page covered in small even handwriting with a column of times in the left margin, was filed as Exhibit A. Daniel Park gave his witness statement on the same afternoon. He sat across from Sandra Reeves in a different room and described in his own words what he had observed at Checkpoint 7 over 3 years of employment. The patterns, the particular passengers, the ratio. He named Craig. He named 2 other agents. He did not waver. When he came out of the statement room, Marcus Tate was waiting in the hallway and said to him, quietly, "That was right." Daniel Park said, "I know." He straightened his name tag and went back to work. The suspension would become a termination in 43 days. The federal investigation would result in a consent decree requiring mandatory bias auditing at 14 airports across the Southeast. The 2 additional agents Daniel Park had named would each receive formal disciplinary action. The regional supervisor's note, recommend enhanced oversight, not implemented, would be referenced in a congressional subcommittee hearing the following spring. Renee caught her 1:15 flight to Reagan National. She was at her gate with 11 minutes to spare. She sat in the last seat in the boarding area, with her shoulder bag on her lap and her carry-on at her feet, and her phone finally in her hand. She had 12 messages. She opened the one from her supervisor. It read, "Heard from Patricia Voss. Full federal complaint filed. Good work." She closed the message. She did not reply. The boarding announcement came over the speaker and she stood.